Hi and welcome back to the channel. This is the second in a series of videos that I'm going to be doing on my experiences when I worked at the Bitmap brothers back in the 1990s. Now, I am going to say that there are going to be two different versions of each video. There's going to be a public one, which is the one you're probably watching right now, which is going to have the majority of the content, obviously for each video. But then there's going to be a second video, which is actually for my channel members only. And that's actually going to contain exclusive content, which is obviously not available in the public video. I'm actually forced to do that, unfortunately, because otherwise nobody will join my channel. It's just one of those things that you have to do in YouTube land to make things a little bit more enticing for your channel members. They give a little bit of money each month to the channel and help it to grow. And for that, they deserve obviously some extra privileges. One of those privileges is to have some extra insights into my experiences at the Bitmaps, as I said. So yeah, forgive me for that, but it's a thing that I have to do. Anyway, with that said, let's crack on with this video and find out about my first day at the Bitmaps. But before we do that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay, where you can make your tech dreams a reality. PCBWay can also manufacture for you flex and rigid flex PCBs. These are boards where elements are fully flexible or parts are flexible and rigid. The choice is yours. Whether it's PCB prototyping, PCB assembly, 3D printing, or even CNC machining, PCBWay is the way. Starting with an instant quote for your PCB projects, PCBWay will leap into action, building your PCB, assembling it for you if you wish, and once it's passed their quality tests, it'll be winging its way to you in a flash. PCBWay, PCB prototyping the easy way. So in the last video in the series, I told you the story of how I had seen an advert in a games magazine, and it was to work at the Bitmap brothers using 3D Studio, which was, I mean, to be fair, my dream job, I would say. I then went on to explain of how I'd applied for that role, and then I'd gone to Wapping in East London for an interview. I'd attended the interview, and it had seemed to go pretty well. And at the end of the interview, Eric, who was the lead designer of games and their art department, yeah, he was the one who actually interviewed me. And he walked me to the office door and he told me that, you know, he would think about applicants and then he would get back to me after a while once they'd worked out what they were going to do. Well, actually, that's what I said in the last video. But in truth, actually what Eric had said was something along the lines of, so Chris, it was really nice to meet you. Thanks for coming for the interview. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye. And I'd gone out the door, walked down the staircase and got out onto the street. And then I kind of went, a couple of weeks? Yeah, it just didn't register at first. You know, I couldn't believe what he'd said. And then I was walking on thinking, was it a trick of my hearing? Had I sort of imagined that he'd said that? And then by the time I got to the tube station and started heading home, I decided that probably not. I probably had a decent chance of getting the job. In fact, I had a feeling that I already had the job. So yeah, I headed back to my bedsit in Reading and I waited for a letter to come from the Bitmaps. As you can imagine, I was on tenterhooks. I mean, did I really hear Eric saying what I thought he'd said him say, you know, see you in a couple of weeks? I think I did. So yeah, I just have to wait and see what would happen. So I think it was like a week went by, maybe a few days later, and a letter did arrive from the Bitmaps. And in it was a formal offer for the role, for a job at the Bitmaps working on 3D Studio on a 3D art project that they were working on. So in there was a contract for me to sign, and also there were some details in there about who I should contact at the Bitmaps in terms of HR, you know, onboarding onto the role, getting an apartment sorted in London, you know, things like that. So the letter said that I should call and speak to Abby Haynes. She was the office manager, and that she would help me to get an apartment within a reasonable commute of work. And she would also take my bank details and all that other sort of stuff that had to be sorted before I could start. Of course, I also had to immediately hand in my notice at ICL. And I felt quite sad about doing this as I'd really enjoyed my time there. And the people there were really nice. I'd really got on with a lot of people and I'd made some friends. But of course, this job at the Bitmaps, it was a dream job. And I knew I just had to get it done. I had to give in my notice and move on. The guys at ICL were actually very good about it. In fact, they were pleased for me. There were quite a few young guys in my team. I think there were about 3 young guys. I can't remember all their names, but I do remember Steve and Simon. I mention those a little bit later. And I think they actually explained to everyone else on my floor who the Bitmap brothers were and why this was such a big break for me. You know, not everybody was a gamer. There were a mixture of ages of people in that team, but most of them were, I think, at that point were in their 30s. So I'm not sure if everybody there knew about games, but so it was good that they explained that. A couple of weeks later, obviously a month later, I think it was, we were going out on a Friday night for goodbye drinks with my team. And it was a really nice evening as I remember it. And we had a good chat. And, you know, people were patting me on the back and saying good luck with the new position. And I knew that the following day, Saturday, I would be heading off to the Bitmaps and I would probably not come back to Reading again, at least not to live. Abby Haynes had put me in touch with a landlord who owned a small studio flat in Surrey Quays. So Surrey Quays is another area of docklands to the south of Wapping, and it's on the other side of the Thames. And to get there, you'd have to take the tube. The Bitmaps were located in Wapping, but as I said, there was a direct tube line from Wapping to Surrey Quays underneath the River Thames. So on paper, at least, it looked like it was going to be pretty ideal as a place for me to live. The rent was affordable on my new salary, so that's where I decided I would live. So I agreed to the landlord's terms, and the Bitmaps then loaned me the rental for my first month in the apartment. And from what I remember, they also prepaid the deposit, which was a new thing to me. I hadn't had to pay a deposit on a flat before. So that was not only my first month's rent upfront, but I also had to pay the same amount of money again as a deposit, which was, quite a lot of money for me back in those days. So at this point, I hadn't actually passed my driving test. And so I was a little bit stuck on how I could actually move. But one of the guys in work that I mentioned earlier, Steve, he had his own car and he offered to help me move to Surrey Quays. I didn't really own that much at the time, mostly, you know, computer stuff and obviously my clothes and things like that. But all of this stuff would probably go into 3 large boxes, something like that. But I did also own an Amiga 4000, and this was my prized possession at the time. You know, it was the top of the range Amiga from Commodore, and it also had a monitor. I think it was a 1084S sitting on top of it. As soon as I got out of college and I started to earn money, I had then sold on my Amiga 1500 and then upgraded to the Amiga 4000. So yeah, that was my paramour at the time at home. I was always working on that and trying out animations and things like that. So you can imagine that carrying even those boxes and the computer on the train would have been completely impractical. I would have had to have taken probably 2, maybe 3 journeys carrying this stuff on the train, and that would cost a lot of money. So I was very grateful to Steve that he'd actually offered to take me in his car. Another one of the guys at work, Simon, he said he would come along as well to help out, which was great. To be honest, I didn't have that much stuff, but it was really nice that he offered to come along as moral support. And it would make a kind of nice day out with each other, and we could all enjoy in my kind of excitement in this new role. So Saturday morning rolled around and they arrived at my bedsit and they helped me to load up Steve's car with the boxes. And of course, with my Amiga 4000, I carried that myself. And by mid-morning, we were ready and we were heading off to Surrey Quays. There we met my new landlord, who was waiting to give me the keys for the apartment when I arrived. And by the end of the afternoon, we had unloaded my belongings into the new flat. I must admit, I didn't know the area, so it was a little bit awkward. If I'd known the area a bit better, I would have offered to go to the pub and have a drink with them, but I just literally didn't know where to go. So I thought, you know, maybe I should just get on with moving in and getting ready. So shook their hand and, you know, I said to them, you know, thanks a lot for bringing me along here. It was really, really helpful for them to do that. It made a big difference to me. And yeah, we said our goodbyes and they headed off back to Reading. I think I then went into the flat and just moved my boxes around, unpacked a couple of the boxes, you know, put my clothes in a cupboard. There was only actually one cupboard in the entire place. It was pretty small. It was, I think probably the entire apartment was about 16 foot across and 10 foot of that was a living room. The entrance hall came in here. There was a living room here. Then there was a little archway going into a kitchen at here. It wasn't very big. I think the kitchen was about 6 to 8 feet wide, something like that. Then here there was a doorway, no door, just another archway which went into the bedroom. And it was in the bedroom that the only cupboard was. So I had to store all of my belongings in the cupboard. There was no sort of wardrobe or anything like that in the bedroom, no chest of drawers. So yeah, all of my clothes had to go into the cupboard. My Amiga 4000 ended up in the living room on a box because there wasn't actually a table there for a TV or anything like that. But I did have a portable TV. That went on the floor until I could buy a small table. I think it was from IKEA or something like that. And by the end of the afternoon, early evening, I had everything sorted out as much as I thought I needed to that day. And I decided I was going to take the evening a bit easy. So I went out, found out where the local supermarket was. Don't forget that in those days, there was no Google Maps or anything like that. I just literally had to go to the high street. I had an A to Z, one of those books that you used to navigate around with. And I used that to go to where the tube station was. So I knew where that was for Monday. And then on the other side of the road, there was a large shopping center. So I'm pretty sure that that was a supermarket in there. So I headed across the road in there, got some provisions and got myself set up. So, of course, Sunday whizzed by with some nervous energy. I was just watching TV. I think I was playing some games on the Amiga as well. And on Monday, I woke up, I had my shower and got ready to head off to the tube station and to make my way into the new job. So I got there and I traveled under the River Thames on the tube. And while I was doing this, I was thinking about what was going to happen that day. I had a lot of trepidation. I was excited, but it was obviously I was pretty nervous about starting my dream job. But I did have my dream job. And as long as I didn't make a big boo-boo, explode the office or something like that, I thought that this was going to be a pretty special day. So got off the tube, went into the elevator because the tube line that actually runs to Wapping is actually very low. I think it's like the first tunnel that was ever built under a river in the world by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Very famous engineer over here in the UK. He did lots of amazing stuff back in the sort of Victorian era. So yeah, it was quite a big ride upwards in a big lift. I think it was a big old clanky lift, and came out of the tube station. And if you watched the previous video, you would have seen me coming out of that tube station and then heading to the right. So you come out of the tube station onto Wapping High Street, and it's an area full of warehouses. And yeah, you head right, heading towards the office. So you may recall from my previous video in the series that the Bitmaps had a converted warehouse in Wapping, which used to be part of the sprawling docklands of East London. Now, the area had been largely firebombed during World War II, and I would imagine that it would have largely remained pretty derelict from the early 1950s until the 1970s. This was common in London. Not a lot of money was available in the UK after the war. It cost us a huge amount of money. The US had loaned us a lot of money for them to help fight against the Nazis. And unlike Germany, we were not given any breaks, as far as I'm aware. And unfortunately, that left the UK in a very bad state economically. So this whole area of Wapping was, like I said, largely derelict for a very long time. Lots and lots of warehouses, which weren't really needed anymore because I think the main commercial docks had moved up the river, because the river by that point was not really big enough for the sort of commercial ships you had, which had been getting larger and larger during the 60s and early 70s. But by the 1970s, the local council had taken some steps to make the area more amenable to redevelopment. They'd filled in the old docks, or at least some of them, and then they'd landscaped the area. So by the late 80s, developers had the notion of converting the remaining old derelict warehouses into new apartments. There had been a development in the Isle of Dogs where some large commercial buildings had been built for banks. So I think the idea was that this area could now be a place where people who wanted to work in that area could come and live. So they built new apartments and they converted a lot of these old warehouses into apartments. And they also built other amenities in the area to try and make the place into a little bit more of a community. I think there also was a large shopping centre called Tobacco Dock. But for some reason that had turned out to be something of a white elephant. I never quite understood that. I remember seeing it from the main road, which travels through Wapping. And for some reason it was closed and apparently never really opened. So that was a bit weird. Anyway, I headed on the high street and around the corner, and soon enough I was heading in through the entrance into the warehouse up to the first floor. And I was pressing the doorbell on the large red cast iron doors to the office. I waited there, nervously, and after about a minute, something like that, Abby opened the door and she let me in. So on this first day, I was told by Abby that I was mainly going to be dealing with Mike Montgomery, and Mike was one of the 3 original Bitmaps. He'd helped found the company when they'd got together with the author, the original author of Xenon, their first game, Steve Kelly. And Steve had actually started this off as a solo project, and then somehow, I'm not quite sure how, Mike and Eric Matthews had got together with him and helped him to finish that game, and that was the first game that the Bitmaps actually produced. So yeah, I'm not really sure about the timeline or the exact story of Xenon, but I know Eric had actually produced the graphics for it, I think, or had had some hand in the graphics, because there were scans of him on the right-hand side of the screen where he would say like level 1 before a level started. And at the time, that was extremely cool, because that kind of thing wasn't really possible. Animations like that, almost like a little mini video on the Commodore 64. And all of a sudden here you had was a platform where that kind of thing was possible. So that little video in itself was something quite groundbreaking. I remember seeing that and being impressed by it. Oddly now, that face was the face of the guy that I would be working, day in and day out, which is quite surreal, I suppose. So yeah, I assume he also worked on the graphics, but then I'm assuming that in the years that followed, he'd sort of developed into more of a sort of general creative powerhouse of the Bitmaps. And by the time I had obviously started to work there, he seemed to be focusing purely on game design. I don't think he did any graphics whatsoever, because the Bitmaps had discovered 2 really good bitmap artists, Mark Coleman and Dan Malone, and they were sort of industry-leading bitmap artists. And so I guess, Eric had demurred and realized that these guys were probably better than him. And so I decided to focus on game design, which was obviously an important part of the game-making process. So yeah, he was the kind of creative leader of the company. Now, by this point in 1994, Mike appeared to be mainly working as a sort of office manager. Now, I know I said Abby was the office manager. So what do I mean by office manager? Well, I think on Z, Mike was actually corralling the other programmers who didn't actually work in the office. So he would have been getting the builds of the game that were sent. I think they were sent from a small team in Northern England. And then he would have obviously been checking these to make sure they worked, and then making sure that Eric had those so that he could test the game. And then Eric would then work on those in his office, and that was how things would progress. But as far as I was aware, Mike was not working as a software engineer programmer. That was being done by other people in the team. But he also then arranged for the computers for me and a new co-worker, Terry Cattrall. We had to have cubicles set up and PCs put in place for actually, for us to work on. So when I arrived, it appeared that Mike was a little busy. So Abby ushered me into the kitchen and offered to make me coffee, which was very nice of her. And she also showed me where all the bits and bobs were in the kitchen, where the toilets were, things like that. And she said, I should feel free to make myself a coffee from then onwards whenever I wanted to. So I was in the kitchen with her and we were drinking coffee and chatting when Mike actually came into the kitchen and he introduced himself. He asked me to follow him, and he took me into the main development office, where a few of the people were sitting that I'd seen during my interview with Eric a few weeks prior to that. Mike took me over to my desk and he introduced me to Terry, who had already arrived. Now, Terry was an interesting person, and we'll discuss my relationship with Terry later on in this series of videos. Terry, it seems, was my age. He had been teaching himself graphics for the previous 3 to 4 years. I didn't know any of this stuff. I've just read it in his bio since then. And at the same time that he was doing this, I was in college, as I said, studying graphic design. So Terry had done some self-study, and he had apparently taught himself cell-based animation. I'm not sure if he did a course in it as well. So I'm talking about hand-drawn animation. But it appears he'd also then moved into 3D as I did, as I guess he probably saw, like me, that 3D would be the future. Now, remember, at this time, there was a big transition going on in terms of animation. So over in Hollywood, Disney was still hanging on to the notion that 2D animation was their heritage and it was also their future. But in the next couple of years, Pixar Studios, who I think at that point owned by Steve Jobs still, would release Toy Story, and that would be a very disruptive force. That would begin to show the sort of death knell for 2D animation. So it was a tough time to plumb into 3D animation. It was still relatively crude when compared to 2D animation at the time. I think 2D animation still had the sort of edge in terms of quality. But I think if you were into computers, you knew that computers would get faster, they would get more capable, and the 3D software would grow and develop, and you would then be able to use that power to do better things. So certainly Terry and I both knew that we had bet on the right horse, and it was very exciting to be pretty much in on the ground floor on this exciting new field. I must admit, of all my 3D skills at that time, animation was probably my weakest aspect. I was a good artist, I had good illustrator level draftsman skills, and I was able to hand paint textures for 3D use as well as enhance scans in Photoshop. I could also model to a pretty high degree, though of course 3D Studio did kind of place a limit on what you could do in those days. 3D Studio was better to modeling what are called hard surfaces. So if you're thinking about making a bottle like this would be quite easy to do in 3D Studio. But modeling an organic shape like a hand like this would be basically nigh on impossible because you couldn't model organic shapes like this. Those tools didn't exist yet. But when it came to hard surface modeling and even trying to do organic modeling, I was pretty good. I had a pretty good grasp of 3D Studio. So yeah, this software was in the early days of its development, but you knew in the future things would get better. I would say my lighting skills were probably my strongest point. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think it was a combination of a few things. Being a draftsman, being able to draw, in other words, I was interested in how light worked. When you're shading objects, you need to understand where light comes from, how it creates shadows, 3D volumes and things like that. So that gave me a bit of an edge in terms of lighting. I was a big fan of Ridley Scott in particular, who was a director that did his own art direction. And what that means is typically when you have directors on a film, they will be there mainly to try and tell the story. You will have a cinematographer who's the guy behind the camera. And the cinematographer will frame shots and make sure that they are lit effectively so that he can tell the story that the director wants to tell. But Ridley Scott was a bit of an auteur because he not only was the director who would try and tell the story, he was also basically the cinematographer. He was the guy looking through the lens, and he was also the guy who would light his shots. And he was famous, for instance, to go into shots and individually arrange elements to make sure that the shot was absolutely perfect. And this kind of stuff was exactly the kind of stuff that I was interested in, producing really interesting lighting to, make shots really, really work. So yeah, definitely think that was a big influence. I'd also taken an intensive photography course in college when I was doing my degree, and I gained a very strong understanding of practical lighting from that. So that was also a formative thing. But yeah, anyway, at this point, my animation skills were pretty basic. 3D Studio was pretty much the first 3D app I'd ever used where animation was practical. 3D Studio, because it plumbed for scanline technologies, it allowed you to actually produce frames very quickly, which meant you could do animations. So Terry, he would actually mentor me at the Bitmaps. Eric said that he would take the lead in terms of animation, that he knew animation better than me, that I would be leading, I think, in terms of modeling and lighting. So I thought that was good. I had my responsibilities, my strengths, and he had his. But of course, this would obviously set up a rivalry between myself and Terry. Of course it did. We were both young men in a two-man team, testosterone and all of that. We were both on a pretty level playing field, and yeah, we would be competing against each other in the future for work. So, to work on certain projects. So I knew I was slightly behind him in terms of animation for sure, but I felt that I had a lot of other strong points to compete with, which was why Eric had hired me in the first place. I also had a little bit of a technical bent, which I don't think Terry had. When I was younger, I'd done some assembly coding. I'd done some scripting when I was in university to produce my presentations. So Eric knew about this. So I also felt that my technical side also gave me some strength. So yeah, I thought, in this two-man team, I would be able to hold my own. So Mike told me that we'd both been given Pentium PCs to work on, and that was pretty exciting. They were, the hot new hardware at the time. I don't remember the exact specs of the machines. I don't think they were branded machines from what I can remember, but I do remember that they were 90 megahertz Pentiums. And they both had a lot of memory. My machine and Terry's machine were exactly the same machine. They both had, I think, 32 megabytes of RAM, which was a lot of memory for that period. I think a year or so earlier in college, we had a machine with about 24 megs of RAM. So all of a sudden, we were using 32. These machines also had fast graphics cards, which could drive the 3D graphics in 3D Studio in Super VGA mode, which was, I think, 640 by 480 in real time. Though complex, 3D models would only be drawn in box mode. And that would mean you would get real-time graphics only in box mode. So if you can imagine, if I move the character's arm, it would render as a box, and every single part of his hand would render as a box. But when you stop moving the model, it would then render the entire real wireframe. But I think we also had to do some optimizations on that. 3D Studio had some tricks where you could show every other line in a model, and that meant that the graphics card only had to draw half as many lines. So this graphics card had accelerated wireframe rendering, from what I remember. So yeah, that made it quite a bit faster. So it was good. It was better than the machine that I had at ICL, but it wasn't exactly like a quantum leap or anything like that. But definitely would make animation a little bit easier because you could see where you were placing the, the arms of the characters a little bit more easily than you could when I was working at ICL. Terry and I had a quick chat, and it turned out that we were pretty similar to each other. We had a lot in common. We were both avid gamers, and I think Terry had possibly been a more avid gamer, or at least I'd thought about getting into working in the games industry a little bit earlier than me. I didn't really have the ambition from when I was a kid that I even thought that I could get into the games industry. And an ex-girlfriend of mine who I split up with just before I went to college, it was actually her auntie that had been very, very influential. She had said to my girlfriend that, unless you have a degree, you're not going to get anywhere in life. And my girlfriend at the time was really adamant that she had to get a degree. And I think she pushed me into getting a degree as well, and which wasn't a bad thing. She was definitely thinking about me in the best way possible. But it seemed Terry had sort of shortcut all of that and had just got himself directly into games a few years earlier, just sort of learning on the job as it was. So yeah, that was interesting. Terry was into music in a big way. I like bands. I had quite an eclectic mixture of music that I liked. I liked Nirvana, sort of grunge metal. Early I liked heavy metal, but I was more sort of into grunge and indie at that time, I suppose. But I also liked Cypress Hill. I think it's Black Sunday was an album which I used to listen to a lot on MTV in the evenings. I think my landlord had MTV in my room. I remember being able to watch that. And that was a band which I just thought was fun at the time. I wasn't into kind of rap music or any of the sort of marijuana lifestyle or any of that. I just enjoyed their music. And Terry, he had a pretty eclectic musical taste as well. And over the next couple of years, that was something that we would share, a love of music. And when we would work with each other, we would quite often have the music on when we were there in the evenings and nobody else was there, and especially on the weekends. Anyway, after a while, Eric had finished the meetings he was having, and he came out of the room, his office, where the interview. And he and a guy came out, quite a short guy, Simon Knight. I'd become friendly with him in the future. So Eric introduced us to Simon, and then Simon headed back to his desk, which was just behind where me and Terry sat. So Eric dragged a chair over and he went into his office, and he came back with a small bundle of A2 artboards, black cardboard artboards. On these, I could see photocopied artwork, and these were the storyboards for the intro sequence for Zed. And our first task as the new 3D department for the bitmaps was to get this sequence constructed, lit, animated, and then rendered to high standard. So yeah, we definitely had our work cut out for us. Can you imagine how exciting this was? Here I was at my favorite game developer, about to make what appeared to me to be like a short movie. It was absolutely epic. I couldn't believe it. I was sitting there sort of pinching myself that, Eric, a video game developer, sort of hero of mine, was now sitting next to me telling me what I was going to do for the Bitmap brothers. Now, as I said earlier, I was a pretty decent artist at that time. And so one of the things that hit me when I first saw the storyboards was how amateur they looked. They looked like they'd been drawn by someone in secondary school using a biro pen. They were scribbly, dark, quite crude. And I must admit, this didn't really inspire much confidence. I think Eric read the room. He picked up these vibes from me and Terry, and he went on to explain that they were drawn by two guys. I think it was Jake that actually drew them. Yeah, two guys, Will Jeffrey and Jake West. And Eric explained Jake and Will were hired to produce the story and the storyboards and the plot and all of that. It appears that Jake and Will were both ex-film students, and they had some experience in this space. So I understood, and I decided to look past the sort of basic rendering to see what the story was actually about. So anyway, Eric went on to explain that the basic plot was that Brad, who was this kind of cocky robotic soldier, and his less confident partner, Alan, They were unconscious after a drinking party in their small dropship, which was sort of floating in space, if you can imagine, looking sort of derelict. And the idea was to give the impression that the dropship was derelict, that maybe something really bad had happened, and that Brad and Alan were dead. You know, they were slumped over the flight console. So Eric said, you know, think about aliens for the kind of mood that we want in these, you know, sort of establishing shots inside the dropship. Then the dropship's radio would blink. It would blink to life with an incoming call. And then Brad would sort of regain consciousness, you know, awakened by the bleeping. And he would answer the call. And then he would be confronted by a shouting sort of commanding officer. Character was called General Zod. So Eric said this character was based on Colonel Kilgore from Apocalypse Now. Not sure if you're familiar with that movie by Francis Ford Coppola. Well, you know, if you're going to choose your film references, then I guess you've got to aim high. And Eric had already said that we were doing things based on aliens to some degree in Apocalypse Now. So yeah, definitely this was going to be easy, right? So General Zod, yeah, he lambasted Brad and Alan for being late to a battle. And so they kick the dropship into overdrive and they head off to battle, you know, the ship whizzing around through space. So after the briefing, I thought, you know, it's pretty cool. It was short, pretty punchy, a little bit of humor in there, you know, a bit of jeopardy at the beginning, you know, which then pays off when you realize, in fact, they're not dead, that they, you know, they've just been drinking a lot. And they also introduced the robot soldiers that you'll be playing in game. And so I thought, you know, it was a little sequence that would be pretty cool, a little title sequence rolled into there as well. And I thought it would be actually, you know, pretty cool. So the way I looked at it was Terry and I had the challenge to take what was handed to us, these storyboards. Like I said, they were pretty rough looking, but it was our job to turn each one of those frames into something special. So I felt that the challenge was set and yeah, we would just have to see if we were up for it. So to my surprise, and I also think Terry's surprise, it turned out that the models for Brad, Alan, General Zod, I think the fortresses as well on the planets, they'd already been produced, modeled and textured. And to this day, I still don't quite understand how that happened. Eric didn't really explain it to us. Why am I going on about this? Well, as I said, you know, I was a pretty decent modeler and I saw these characters and I thought, well, this is going to be cool. I'm going to be able to get maybe to model one of these or Terry, you know, but the models that Eric showed us, they were missing some refinements, such as they didn't have bevels on their corners. And that meant that they didn't catch the light as well as they could have done. But overall, I thought they were well modeled. They had good character. You know, the characters were obvious from them and their texturing was actually pretty good. Although there was some streaking in a couple of areas, which was quite difficult to deal with in 3D Studio. But there were ways that you could actually do that. And I think I could have fixed it if I was given the time, but Eric didn't really want to go there. So at that point, I thought it was fine. You know, we had plenty of other work to do. So it was good that in a way we had a bit of a head start. What hadn't been produced at that point was any lighting design for the interior of the dropship. There were no planet models because in the game you visit different planets. So the models for the surface of these planets didn't exist, and that was technically a very difficult thing to do. So we would have fun, you know, producing those and texturing them. Also, there were various in-game creatures, which meant that some of those had to be made to feature in future cutscenes. I think there was a penguin and a pterodactyl kind of thing. It wasn't a pterodactyl because this wasn't set in the dinosaur era. But when I saw the game demo to me, Eric had pointed out that there were these flying lizards. So yeah, we had to produce models of those as well. So there were some interesting modeling challenges that we would have to rise to in the production of the game. After this meeting broke up, it was heading towards lunchtime. So Eric took me and Terry around the office and he introduced us to everyone there. So I won't go through everyone in this video in a lot of detail, as I think it makes sense to make a specific video about the people in the office at this time between 94 to 96 in the future. And the reason for that is some of the people who worked on the game weren't actually in the office at this time and I hadn't met them. So it doesn't kind of make sense at this point in time. But anyway, like I said, we'll do a specific video in the future where I'll give you sort of mini bios of everybody as much as I knew them at the time. So we went over to Simon Knight, who I'd said hello to earlier, and also Steve Kelly sat next to him. So if you can imagine, me and Terry was there, I was there in a cubicle together. Then there was a corridor which ran from a door there and went past us into Eric's office. And then sitting here was Simon Knight. And then to his left was Steve Kelly, as I said, who sat next to him. So Simon was one of the game designers. Hadn't heard about him before that point, but he also did tech support as well. And I think he was the one who had actually ordered our PCs. Whenever there was a problem with the PCs in the following days, I thought I would have to go and talk to Mike, but pretty early on, Mike said to me and Terry, if you've got any problems with the PCs, go and talk to Simon because he knows what he's talking about. And I think it was actually Simon who set up our PCs because he knew exactly how they worked and how they were set up. I think he'd actually set up 3D Studio on them as well. As well as being tech support, Simon was actually, as I said, a game designer, and he was the one who was leading the Chaos engine. And Eric also worked on that as well. So every now and again, they would go off into Eric's office and have meetings about that. And I was very interested in the Chaos engine too, because I was a big fan of the first game. So like I said, Steve Kelly sat to the left of him, and Steve Kelly was one of the original 3 bitmaps. And he'd, as I said earlier, written their first game, Xenon, or as it was originally known when he was authoring it, Kelly X. And he was also working on the Chaos Engine 2 with Simon. So I guess that's why obviously they sat next to each other. So next to Steve Kelly was another Steve Cargill. Steve Cargill was quite a big chap, quite tall, quite cheerful, friendly. And Eric explained to us that he worked on tools. Now, I must admit at that time, I didn't really know what this meant. I wasn't going to ask a lot of questions about things like that. I thought I could pop over and have a chat with Steve at some other time and find out what they meant by tools. I'd had very little exposure to game development at that point, basically none, only the stuff I'd read in magazines. So I kind of nodded sagely as if I understood, and I smiled and I said, yeah, sounds cool. So then we headed across the hallway. So there was a door next to Steve, and we headed across through Mike's office, which was sort of right in the middle of the office. And we went into the office where Abby Haynes was, and she was at the front of the office next to the windows. And it appeared Abby shared some responsibilities with Renegade Software. She seemed to do a multitude of jobs. She was answering the phone, ordering in goods for the kitchen, coffee and sugar and all that sort of stuff. She was arranging meetings with magazines, you name it, she did it. She was a real glue person and actually made the office run nice and smoothly. Next to her office was an office with a musician in it, Chris Small. That's M-A-U-L-E, although Eric used to make fun of him saying it was Chris Small. But Chris Small was actually working on the music for Zed. And Eric explained to us that they had this idea that they were going to try and do interactive music. So in other words, when the sort of drama went up in the game, when timers were getting short and something very dramatic was going to happen, the music would change to reflect this. And that Chris was working on that project, write the music, and also technically try and work out with the programming team how that musical system was going to work. So I found that really interesting. Then we headed back through Mike's office and then to the right. That was into a part of the office that was quite small, and that was where the Renegade Software team were. And Eric explained to me that Renegade Software was their own publisher, that they partially owned the company. And it seemed that, I read about this later, I didn't really know this at the time, but the Bitmaps had made a partnership with a record producing company called Rhythm King to form Renegade Software. So it seems it was a partnership, they both put money in, and together they'd formed this video game publisher. And the reason why they did that was that they could then put their own money into publishing their own games. And then based on the profit from those games, they could also then try and publish other companies' games. And they had an ethos that they would act as the kind of publisher that they wished that they had in the first place. They'd had massive problems with Microsoft, and I think they were really badly burnt by that, and something that they hoped that they would remedy by having their own software publisher, Renegade Software. So that was pretty interesting. And another side of it was that they could then try and create some synergies by using some of the artists from Rhythm King and getting their music into their games. And it was one of these synergies that led to Bomb the Bass, one of their tracks called Mega Blast, being used for the title music on Xenon. Not even sure if Mega Blast was called that because of the collaboration with the Bitmaps, or whether it was just coincidental. Based on the name and the fact it was used in a video game, I'm assuming that they named the music specifically for the game. So I think that's quite interesting. Another collaboration that they did was with Betty Boo. She had a track, I think it was called Doing the Do, and I think that was used in Magic Pocket. So that was another interesting side of the Bitmaps, that they had this kind of collaboration going on with Rhythm King. So there was one last room. There was the kitchen, which was right by the entrance, and then there was a corridor with a toilet, and then past the toilet, there's a room at the back of the office, far away from everywhere else, which I will call the glory hole. Now, we'll talk about the glory hole in a video in the future. Don't worry about it. There's nothing weird going on. It was a very nice room, and I'm sure you'll like what I found in there. I found it pretty amazing, so I'll share that with you in another video in the future. So anyway, with the tour of the office complete, we went for our lunch to Wapping High Street to get a sandwich, which appeared to be something of a sort of ritual at the Bitmaps. To be fair, there weren't that many shops around at the time. There was no corner shop like there is these days at the end of the road. So you had to go there to get any sort of food. So it was a sandwich or a sandwich. That was the sort of choice you had pretty much every day. And to be honest, that was fine with me. I was happy. You know, I was a student, and to be fair, I was eating, well. So yeah, I was happy enough with that. So in the afternoon, as the day progressed with me and Terry, we sat down and we were sitting at our PCs, and we were kind of trying to get them set up to work on. We were trying to become familiar with them. I don't recall that there was a lot to do, but I did recall that I had to run Windows if I wanted to use Photoshop, and then I had to quit out of Windows if you wanted to run 3D Studio. So Windows at that time was required to run Photoshop, as I recall, but you couldn't run 3D Studio from within Windows. It used a different memory management system, so I think you had to reboot the machine to get enough memory to run 3D Studio. And that was a real pain. But to be fair, I was doing this at ICL, and it was my workflow there. But still, it was a grind. I was kind of hoping that things would have progressed. But at this point, these were simpler times where the idea of running Photoshop, at the same time as a major 3D app like 3D Studio just wasn't going to happen. It was kind of laughable. There wasn't any multitasking here. And, as I was fiddling around with my machine and trying things out and sort of encountering that, I think I went over and talked to Simon because I said I couldn't get 3D Studio to boot. And he explained to me about this autoexec bat file and config.sys, and that I'd have to go in there and tweak the memory manager. So he came over and sat with me, and he helped me with that to get things working. Anyway, once this was done, I was sitting there thinking, if 3D Studio and Photoshop had been released on the Amiga, it would have been completely different, because you could have run both of those packages at the same time within the Amiga OS. And it just made me think about how advanced the Amiga was. And in fact, what's crazy, right? This was 1994, and the Amiga was released in 1995. So that would have been possible all the way from the beginning back in 1985, some 9 years earlier. Just makes you realize how advanced the Amiga was for the time. But anyway, this wasn't the case. I'd have to switch back and forth between DOS, MS-DOS and Windows, to go between these two apps that I'd have to use day in, day out. So yeah, that was a bit of a pain, but that was the reality. In terms of video editing, if you're thinking about something like Premiere Pro or something like that from Adobe, this was before Premiere Pro. There was no video editing software. What you had to do instead was you had to render out a series of images. I think we would render them out in 24-bit Targa files, TGA files, with no compression, so pretty big files. And then we would use a command line utility in MS-DOS, and you would put in the range of files, and that would then compile them into a video sequence. I think we were using Bink. I think that was the video tool at the time, but Mike Montgomery had some plans to replace that with our own video system. But I think when we started, we were using Bink. And what would happen is you would then end up with a bunch of videos, which you would then have to string along using a utility. So there was a little script that you would type in the name of the videos and what order they were in, and it would basically just load them up. And I think it would cache them so that when you went from one video to the next, the sequence was unbroken. So you would get the effect that this was one continuous sequence, but in fact it wasn't. And I guess when we were happy with that, we could then take that list of frames and then combine those all together to turn it all into one sort of continuous video. Anyway, it was basic, but that's how we would get things done. We had the storyboards, we knew what the shots were, so we would make do. So anyway, around 5:45 that day, the day came to an end, a bit later than what I was expecting, but this was video games, and people seem to work a little bit later than in most jobs. And from what I recall, Eric suggested that we all go to the local pub, which was further along Wapping High Street. It's called the Captain Kidd. And apparently the Captain Kidd was like one of the oldest pubs in London, and it was used as an execution site for pure pirates back in the era, which was a bit macabre. But anyway, it was an interesting pub. I remember it was all wood beamed inside, and the wood beams had sort of been sprayed in some kind of plasticizing agent. So all of the wood in there was quite shiny, and it felt a little bit spongy, plastic. Maybe they had like a major woodworm problem and they had to, spray it with chemicals. And then once that was done, to make sure it didn't have a problem, they then sealed it in this plastic material. Yeah, it was very weird, but very odd. But I guess you've got to be drastic sometimes to keep a building of that age in good shape. Anyway, drinks were ordered. We sat down and we had some drinks and a chat. Terry and I, we got to know some of the other staff. We had a chat with Steve Kelly a little bit. And I remember that Mike didn't stay. He went straight home as he had to drive all the way back to Essex each day. In fact, I remember Mike being, during my time at the Bitmaps, being a little bit sort of antisocial. I don't think I ever saw him attend any of these social gatherings or go to a trade show or any stuff like that. Eric, I think, always handled that sort of stuff. He was a good talker. So yeah, it was a little bit sad that we didn't get to know Mike. Even to this day, I don't really know him very well, but that's just the way it was. So anyway, that was my first day at the Bitmap Brothers. And as far as I could go, it had gone pretty well. I hadn't tripped and, smashed the fish tank or broken my PC or, put my foot in my mouth or anything like that. So, I felt pretty good about that. Tomorrow beckoned when Terry and I would sort of sit down and try and break down the intros into shots a little bit better. And we would try and work out exactly what it was that we were going to do next. We had some Fortress models to enhance. As I said earlier, they'd been modeled, but they needed a little bit of work on them to sort of set dress them, to sort of blend them into the environment. And we needed to make those landscapes for the different planets, the Arctic, desert, jungle planets and all that. Then there were the creatures to make. So we had to work out when we needed to make those, who would be lighting the dropship, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we knew we had our work out for us, but it would be exciting. And I think we were, quietly confident that we would make, something pretty special. So in my last video in the series, it was published, I think, a little bit under a year ago now. It's actually today, I think it's July the 24th. And I think that video was published in early August. And to be honest, I wasn't quite sure what I would say next. I had some trepidation. Now, I must admit, I've always been a little bit nervous about making this series of videos. My experiences at the Bitmaps are, pretty personal to me. In many ways pretty precious, but they were not all positive, of course. There were amazing highs. There were also some very deep lows. But overall, it was an amazing period of my life where I literally walked a path through my dream job, and every day was some kind of adventure of sorts. Now, of course, it's been a long time, and you have to take what I say with a tiny pinch of salt. What I express here is my story, how I remember it, and of course, we're seeing it from a great distance of 30 plus years. Some facts here will obviously not be 100% accurate. For example, I can't at this point remember the names of every person working in the Bitmaps office. This is any sort of slight towards those people. It's just me that I'm aging and, my memory has slipped in that regard. And they're just names of people that I haven't had to use for the last 30 years. So unfortunately, those have slipped from my memory. But at the same time, I have thought long and hard on the content in this video, and in the videos that follow, I will try and endeavor to make those as accurate as possible as can be. Also, I really wish that I knew some of the details of how the Bitmaps had fared before I joined in 1994, the deals that they'd had with publishers, the people who worked there before me, and possibly who worked there after me. Now, I would say that the Bitmaps had a pretty high churn rate in terms of personnel. I now know that there were a lot of people, apart from Eric, Mike, and Steve, who worked at that company. When I worked there was a team, and there were many other people who worked in that team before and after. And I think in future videos, we'll discuss why that might have been a thing. Although, to be fair, I only had my own, quite small window on the history of the Bitmaps, so I'm not quite sure about that. But anyway, we'll discuss that in the future. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and it's given you a little bit of an insight into what went on with the offices in Wapping. Of course, this is only a tiny slice, but I think it's set the stage for future episodes where I can expand on my story and the story of Zed's development, at least from what I observed at the time and what I have gleaned since then from historical notes that I've read on the internet. The next videos in this series will be a mixture of videos like this. Let's describe these as the sort of main timeline videos, but I will intersperse those with short videos where I will recount for you smaller chapters and also anecdotes, which I hope will give you a flavor of what it was actually like to work in that studio environment. It was very dynamic, it was great fun, and it's something, you know, I will never forget. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. That's it for now. If you are not a member of my channel, please join the channel. And if you do, don't forget you will get access to the extended version of this video where there's a lot more information. And also, don't forget, you will get access to the extended version of the future videos as well. So that's something definitely I think to look forward to. If you haven't been here before, and even if you don't want to join the channel, please make sure you subscribe and also that you like the video so this video goes out to other people. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next video in this series or some of my other videos. Make sure to check out the other videos that I produce as well. Until I see you next time, take care and have a good day.